Welcome, everybody. And it's very exciting to have these two dynamic speakers. For the first time, they're actually colleagues. We normally have two speakers, but they're not generally working in the same firm. These two are Ravi and Stephen. So it's great to have them. They're going to introduce themselves in a moment. But I think the background, the backdrop for this Faith in Business is of course, the COP26, and that makes what they're going to share with us, I think, really exciting. And I remember years ago a film coming out by Al Gore called An Inconvenient Truth, and I went to see it, and it was all about the bad news about the environment, and it was really shocking. But I thought afterwards, and I wrote a reflection called A Convenient Truth, partly because being so focused on the business world, I don't see business always considering the environment to be an inconvenient issue. I keep meeting entrepreneurs and business leaders and even people in big multinational so-called oil companies, and we heard about Shell this morning, who consider this not an inconvenient truth at all, that something's happening to the environment, but actually they've based their strategy for the next few years on the basis of climate change and see huge opportunity in the green economy and the green revolution that we need. I think we've moved on a long time since that film, because Al Gore made that film to counter a lot of climate skepticism. And I don't really see much of that anymore. So I think this COP26 is taking place in a different environment than other UN summits. And that's something to be really excited about. So my view on the environment is positive environmentalism, that we can be positive in the face of the real and quite urgent challenges that the climate imposes on us. So I think that is the kind of context in which we gather. And I think from these two guys, we'll go away with plenty of positive environmentalism. We know the kind of the doomsday scenario, but I think from these guys, they're doing something about it. And it's a privilege to hear what that is and for them to bring their Christian faith to their perspective. So it's over to them. I'm going to ask you both to introduce yourselves in a few sentences, and then we're going to hear each of your talks in turn. But please, if you have questions, either when they're speaking or when they're done, just pop them into chat. We'll have question and answer session, and we'll have discussion after that. And they may even, because there's two of them, be able to look at the chat whilst the other one's speaking. So you never know, you might get a response in chat, or they'll work your question into their remarks. So do get going on chat if you have something burning to ask. Okay, over to you two guys, Ravi and Stephen.
Thanks, Peter. It's great to be here. And so my name is Ravi. I'm a director at Edge Digital Manufacturing, which is a business that Stephen and I set up 3 years ago. And it's been great being part of some of these faith in business meetings and the conferences, because it sort of allows you to take the day job, but then think about some of those issues with a slightly broader perspective and bringing your faith into it. So I'm quite excited to see where the conversation goes today, and really hope that what we share sparks some good breakout room discussions in a little bit. Stephen, do you want to introduce yourself as well before we get into the content?
Sure, thanks Ravi. So I'm Stephen Barr, as Ravi's mentioned, a close colleague, and delighted to be so. It's made a huge difference to my experience of working in business, I think, to be working closely with a Christian partner. I'm an engineer by training, so Ravi and I tend to do a double act as kind of a normal part of what we do. We have different background experiences. Ravi is a financier, me more in design and engineering, and I was lucky enough to run the manufacturing advisory service for a few years, which is where I met Ravi. So we go way back, and I think we'll reflect on some of our experiences in a Christian operation as we talk here.
Thanks, Stephen. And actually, what Stephen didn't mention is we both left our previous company on the same day. So it was probably not a surprise that a few years later we set up a business together. And I remember many train journeys commuting into the city, talking about different ideas. So it's great to see that sort of come to fruition. Let me see if I can get these slides to change. I thought I'd start just with a picture that actually features in the journal article, if some of you have seen that. which you'll recognize from Star Wars. And it's this idea of choices. And, as Stephen mentioned, we both sort of had slightly different career paths to get to setting up this business. And for me, part of that journey to building my own business was that desire to be able to align business with personal values. And I find the whole topic of sustainability quite challenging, because it's making me realize that desire to align values isn't a one-time thing, but there's a continuous need to challenge the way we do things, the choices we make, and if you like, our overall purpose. And that's been a theme, I think, over the last year with Faith in Business. So as we come out of the pandemic, I think we've had a real chance to see things differently. And there are choices. Are we going to go back to the way it's always been, or are we going to use this as a moment to maybe do things in a different way? I think today's talk is timely with COP happening, and it's interesting to see all the challenges that are coming out of those discussions, but also the inconsistencies. So we'll talk about green travel, but then travel by private jets is one that sort of sticks out. And there's many more that we could pick on. And I think, to me, what that really reflects is choices are not easy. If this was an easy conversation, we wouldn't be having it. So the one thing I do hope that comes out of this is, we hope to inspire you with some stories of things we're seeing in the manufacturing sector and things we would like to encourage more of. But we recognize these are difficult choices, and there isn't necessarily one right answer.
It's worth, Ravi, just on that point, it's worth remembering that the kind of area we're in, particularly with manufacturing, has actually driven economic development over many centuries now. There was a time, to the early part of last century, where the UK was the biggest polluter in the world, largely because it was the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, but it drove lots of development. I can remember when I was working in Pakistan, 25 years ago now, just seeing the number of graves of Christian missionaries in what was then the sort of front line of British Army operations, I suppose, where lots and lots of engineering technology was being piled into that area. And yet there were Christians working with local communities there. Always been a mixture of those two things.
And that's great. And I think, sort of building on that, we see a responsibility for manufacturing to take a bit of a lead in coming up with sustainable business models and green ways to do things. And one of the things we were going to particularly focus on today, because of our background, is the role that digital technology can play in enabling that journey. So we hope to share with you some examples that we're seeing, particularly looking at the role of digital. If this is a conversation with some of the manufacturing companies we work with, we would often start looking at the different stages of the industrial revolutions. And there's a phrase commonly used about that we're currently in the fourth industrial revolution. And, we would talk about the journey from, go back to steam and all the way through now to cyber physical systems and connectivity. I thought I'd show a slightly different set of images for us today, and just really reflecting on the pace of change over the last 10 to 15 years. Who would have thought when the iPhone and other smartphones came out that would become the way we do business and the way we sort of drive our personal lives? And I was just reflecting earlier with apps like YouTube and the weather on my first iPhone. I really had little use for them, didn't really understand how that could change my life. But, just last week I was watching a church service on YouTube, and I find myself often, checking out the weather before a business trip. And, it's all these things have just become so common in our day-to-day life. We can sometimes, if you like, get lost in that revolution that is happening. But there are also challenges. And, one of the values that I really wrestled with as I was leaving a corporate life was some of the excesses and some of the consumption and greed that really fuels that economy. And that continual striving to achieve certain targets and profit numbers, and almost the profits becoming more important than the clients or the people or the planet. So one of the motivations for me in setting up a business has been to be able to set our own motivations and not necessarily just be striving for the next big deal. But I see that challenge as I look at digital technologies. You might have seen Facebook's announcement last week, and you may have also followed some of the rise of cryptocurrency and non-fungible tokens and all this sort of stuff. And there is that sense that consumption and greed is still pervasive, and it's something that we need to, as believers, wrestle with, because it's not the only answer. And one of the questions we've put for us to think about in our groups is just how we might address that, and where might God be challenging us in terms of breaking out of that culture of consumption and greed. We put a verse here from Luke 12:5. We know that greed isn't good, unlike what Gordon Gekko says. And I think there is a personal challenge to all of us to really consider, as we're thinking about sustainability, what is our personal responsibility. But on to something more positive. We're going to share some examples now and some of the thinking that we've been involved with over the last few months within the manufacturing sector. Stephen, I'll pass over to you at this point.
Yes, just on this one, to make the point that for manufacturing to become more environmentally friendly, to reduce emissions, we need to do two things, not just one. There's a thing that needs to happen within factories, which is improved use of raw materials and improved energy use within a factory environment. And one of the really good things that's happened over the last 20 years, certainly, is a huge reduction in the amount of energy, the amount of dirty energy that factories use. And that's actually because the country as a whole has made a huge shift towards renewable energies. And I think just today, or yesterday rather, something like 50% of UK energy was from renewable sources. And it's been as high as 100%, as you probably know, on certain days over the last year or two. But really, we need to remember that manufacturing is not just about factories. It is, of course, about the use of manufactured products and the services that go with them. So we think about a circular value chain of manufacturing. And the thing that is absolutely not happening quickly enough is developing much better products that are inherently more environmentally sustainable. So they would have a bigger proportion of recycled, recovered materials in them. And they would be used in a much more efficient way. That is not yet happening in anything like the degree that it needs to. So far, if we just continued focusing only on factories, we would get nowhere near net zero targets in any time soon, which of course, as we know from COP26, is a big issue. We have a lot of experience of the kinds of technologies that work on both sides of the fence, if you like, inside the factory and out. And we can talk in much more detail about those if folks are interested in the breakout sessions.
And these technologies we're putting up here are those that we're seeing in the manufacturing sector, but actually could apply to any sector. But one of the things that is common with a lot of these is the investment that's required to get started, the cost in terms of not only buying the kit, but also upskilling staff, finding the time and the bandwidth to introduce change into the business. And all of these things, I feel, have been holding a lot of companies back from making these moves. And that's one of the challenges we want to think about as believers, is to what extent does our faith and our eternal perspective give us a bit more confidence to take some of these risks and to be that first mover. We're going to share a couple of examples from businesses we've been speaking and working with over the recent months, and I hope what you'll see from these examples is the role of the business leader in really setting that vision and taking these bold moves, but also some of the win-win benefits that have come out of it. Should we move on to those two, Stephen?
Sure.
I think you were going to talk about Reina.
Yeah, happy to. So Tom Hollands at Reina Foods is a real evangelist for sustainability, particularly focused on the supply chain. So he's going beyond the factory gates, as it were, but upstream, I suppose you would say, into the supply chain. So what they're doing here is to use digital technologies to help them to trace the provenance of materials. Now, this is important for lots of things, not just food quality, food security. You'll all remember the beef burger crisis. What do I mean? What was the name of that disease? Bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or whatever it was. from 20 years ago, which was quite a thing for the company I worked for at the time. We were advising DEFRA on how to dig themselves out of the mess. But companies like Reina Foods are these days really enlightened about not just traceability of foodstuffs, but the whole thing about quality control. If they can control the quality, if they can also connect more effectively with their suppliers, they can also control the rate of supply of ingredients into, in this case, Reina Foods, which is putting sandwiches together from a whole range of ingredients. If you don't have all the ingredients there piled up in a warehouse for weeks, you have much better control, you have much lower wastage, you have the potential for lower energy to keep all of that material cool until you're actually making things. So management of the supply chain is a crucial issue. And this particular organization is running the digital sandwich project with a number of technology companies, using AI and blockchain as some of the key technologies, and also using what's called a zero trust networking platform, which makes sure that all of the stakeholders involved in that supply chain know that they're sharing data securely and in a commercially sensitive way as well.
Brilliant. And then the second example we were going to give is from a business called Playdale Playgrounds. They've got an inspirational leader, Barry Leahy, and I quite like their little strapline about making children smile. And certainly I can think of many a happy day with my children in a playground. But the thing here is Barry's really been challenging his business to take a long-term perspective. So it's not just about making money today, but it's about being in business and sustainable in 10, 20, 30 years time, but also doing business in a sustainable way. So we can see some of the ways they do that in terms of their materials, in terms of the use of transport and trying to minimize the emissions there, and the role of digital technologies in helping to achieve some of that. But the real long-term benefit that excites me with Barry's business is he's thinking about things like, well, actually, should we be building playgrounds and shipping them around the world? Or is there a better way to do business? So could I license the IP and partner with organizations around the world, and that way, strip out a huge cost base, but also a huge energy inefficiency in the business? And it's this sort of thinking that that really excites us, because we're starting to see new business models emerge, and so many of the conversations with manufacturers around sustainability. Yes, there's low-hanging fruit. There's things you can do today, put in EV chargers or whatever, solar panels or whatever, but the potential is so much greater. But that potential does come with cost and risk, and a real future foresight and an ambition to do that. So one of the questions we thought it would be good to discuss in our groups is around how we can balance these two things. So how can we make some of this stewardship of creation and being environmentally focused as important as the bottom line and as short-term profit today? And perhaps in your businesses or in your client bases, some of these new digital technologies could enable greater sustainability, and how much is that a part of the conversation we're having with our customers? And I'm conscious of time. We want to leave some space for questions. The third element around this is around risk, and this to me is where the rubber hits the road, because we will often talk about building a business case for investment in digital. If you've been around church sermons for a few years, you'll have probably heard the idea of faith being spelled R-A-S-K. And there is something in the fact that we're not in this alone. So, there are costs involved in any of these new technologies. Being the first mover, like I said earlier, bringing teams on the journey, and that whole change process doesn't happen overnight. And even when we've identified a win-win scenario, there will still be resistance that needs to be overcome, and a process of engaging with everyone in the business. One of the things I liked about Barry is how he's brought his whole team on the journey with him. So it's not just the MD says we're going to do this. It's, let's really involve the team internally and externally in that process. So I think, for us, when we sort of put our faith perspective on this, actually, we need to think about how we can be more confident and how we can have more courage, because actually we've got a Father in heaven who's walking this journey with us. So that's sort of one faith challenge I would give. The other one is around the digital dividends. So if we buy into the idea that digital is a win-win and can deliver the sustainability, and we gain time efficiencies and cost savings, what are we going to do with that? Are we just going to plug that back into more consumption, or are we actually going to start to turn that towards really making a difference and kingdom purposes? I don't know, Stephen, do you want to add anything to this one?
Yeah, I'm just busy replying to a question from Jeff online. I think one of the key things we found is a need, in terms of breaking this cycle, a need for getting collaboration, getting understanding, not just within businesses, but also with suppliers and customers. That is a huge challenge, but it is something that is incredibly valuable and productive in moving things forward, getting organizations and individuals to change the way that they think and behave, and the way that they think about the value and the impact of the decisions and the technologies and all the things that go with that, on the environment as well as on their own business results. But a collaborative approach really is the only way to get that moving. So we work really hard to find good ways of doing that.
Yeah, and just building on Jeff's question, and so I'm working with a business at the moment where, you know, they're really keen to get the most out of some of these technologies, but they know that unless the team is behind them, any of these initiatives are just going to, you know, fizzle out. So we're really looking at how do you communicate the advantages, but also how it can really impact people in their day jobs. So, you know, what is this going to do for me as an individual? And I think that same philosophy can apply when we think about the sustainability benefits, because actually a lot of employees care about the planet, and many of them would share a passion for the environment, and you know, would be listening to and taking on board some of that wider messaging that's out there. So actually it's about finding those people who are the champions, who are super engaged with it and want to be advocates, and then building that groundswell of passion, which then leads to action. There's a question that's come in from Mike, which is, I guess, to what extent is this about talk and sort of keeping people inspired? And I think, you know, that there's absolutely a need to not just talk about it, but also to really demonstrate tangible outputs. And I think in terms of keeping that conversation alive and inspiring employees to be able to show them that the business is making a difference and is actually reducing emissions, being more efficient, saving costs. And one example of this is a business we were speaking with in the Northwest, who they're implementing a brand new factory. And what they've decided to do is quite proactively seek every little opportunity in this new factory to adopt green technology. So from capturing rainwater to the use of electrics and all sorts of new efficiencies. And it's been really interesting to just see how excited the whole team has got around that, and how motivating that is to know that your business is at the forefront of trying to make a difference.
It's worth pointing out with that one that it's not purely altruistic, and I think that's a good thing. So, you know, clearly there are people very strongly motivated to design and make things that are environmentally sound, but it is also contributing to the bottom line of the business, because one of the things they're doing is working with partners, universities and so on, who will actually pay them, or at least support the development costs for some of the technologies that they're bringing in. So they can see this as actually quite a solid pathway to being much more competitive in their market. So everybody wins, and that's the kind of thing that we encourage.
There's also something, I think, around being willing to count the cost. And we try to find and help our clients to identify the win-wins, and to really look at which technologies are going to deliver a good return on investment, as well as having sustainability benefits. But I think we perhaps need to go even further as believers, and whether that's in our personal lives and being willing to, for example, give up meat for a day a week or even fully, that actually could potentially hit hard if you really love your meat. Or the long haul travel would be another one from a personal perspective. And I think the same is true from a business perspective. So an example that I actually sort of write about in my article, just not to do with sustainability, but is furlough. So, many businesses have had to use furlough, and that's been a helpful thing over the last 18 months. But businesses had a choice. Do I top up to 100%, or do I just pay the minimum? And that could be the same for, any number of benefits and financial decisions as a business. Stephen and I have a choice every time we're traveling to meet a client. What mode of travel do I use? What am I willing to am I willing to pay extra to make it more green? And I think that cost sort of goes hand in hand with those benefits. And I think as believers, we need to be willing to perhaps think not just about our financial bottom line, but about all these other important things. A couple more questions have come in. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at them, Stephen.
Just looking now. The one about transport miles is interesting. There's a number of aspects of this, but we need global connectivity with other organizations. I mean, whatever we may think post-Brexit, we need to be able to cooperate with other big producers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everything has to be produced a long way away and transported halfway around the world. As you heard from the Playdale example, they're looking and I think succeeding in finding solutions for local building of certain components, local sourcing of materials. So certainly some parts of UK industry are already moving or have already moved to more of an assembly basis for what they do. So they're looking to source locally and put things together to a pattern which is then globally applied. So there are strategies that are certainly helping to reduce transport miles. And even if you can't necessarily do that directly, you can make some of those miles done on a sustainable basis. So for example, the use of electric vehicles for last mile, last 100-mile delivery of manufactured products. We're seeing more of that kind of thing emerging. But there's still a long way to go. It still makes much more sense really to produce locally if that's possible and if that's economical.
So a couple of questions looking at the conundrum of shareholder return and shareholder value, and how that aligns with some of the costs of investing in tech and sustainability. And I mean, it's interesting because I know there is sort of wider work that's ongoing around thinking about how to change corporate governance to better align with a broader perspective. But at the same time, I think it is a little bit of an excuse. And my view would be, in order for a business to exist 10, 20, 30 years from now, we need to be looking after our planet and be adopting the right sustainable behaviors to protect the resources that we need. And I think, that longer term perspective is aligned with shareholder value. So I think perhaps it requires a tougher conversation around targets and focus, and whether there is genuine commitment to make a difference, or if it's just talk. And one of the challenges we've had with a number of our smaller manufacturing clients is they are asked by their customers to sign up to a whole bunch of green commitments, but actually the behaviors that they then encounter are not facilitating that. So for example, if I had access to data and if we were sharing data about how many products my customer needs, then I can manage waste accordingly and produce the right amounts. Or for example, merge products together so that I can reduce the number of shipments, and and all sorts of things, which where digital technology can really help with that, but it requires the customer and the supplier to both be talking and connected and sharing the data. But often you'll have the stick of you need to say you're green and meeting these commitments, but without the carrot of actually supporting that and making that possible.
I love Adora's question there about, well, ending up with, as believers, we want to respect government law, but also protect stakeholders. I'd absolutely agree with that. And something very positive came out of COP26 just yesterday. It was reported on the BBC about how a large number of countries, I think it's something like 40 countries, have signed up to cooperate on regulations that would actually encourage the development of sustainable products in the future. So through taxation, I guess, but also through regulations that would be consistent across key manufacturing companies that would encourage manufacturers to do the right thing. They would either get taxed if they do the wrong thing, or they would be encouraged, incentivized if they do the right thing. So technologies, I guess, that would have perhaps a local basis, but also technologies that have a higher proportion of recycled materials and inherently have less impact on the environment when they are being used. So I can see actually a very strong positive of government intervention. And that should eventually work through to benefiting the stakeholders, the shareholders in industrials. It may take some time for that to be the case, for people to see it more as carrot than stick, but I think that will happen in due course. And if it doesn't happen, then it'll be imposed anyway.
So we've got time just for one more question, and then we're going to move into the breakout rooms. I thought I'd just pick up on what Margaret's asked around grass-fed meat, and I don't have a direct answer to the meat question, but it does remind me of a leather company that I came across just a couple of weeks ago who were involved in one of these sustainability projects. And what they are doing differently, which is quite interesting, is thinking about not just the cows, but the land that the cows live on, and that broader context around the soil, and really thinking about regeneration. And so one of the aspects around the circular economy is thinking about how what we do can be regenerative and I guess self-improving. So a lot of work is being done behind the scenes, I think, to come up with new ways of thinking about how to look at it end to end. The challenge, I think, is for businesses to take the plunge themselves and say, yes, I want to be part of that movement, and I want to really embrace some of these concepts and see how I can apply them in my own business.